Hello everyone, welcome to Asura Psych, and today we're going to be discussing a documentary that released last week called Persona: The Dark Truth Behind Personality Tests. This specific documentary is focused on talking about the ethical concerns of using personality tests like MBTI or Big Five for things like job selection or choosing whether or not someone is a good candidate for a job, these sorts of things. Most of the times when we look at a documentary focused on personality tests or we look at an article focused on personality tests, they're attempting to criticize the validity or reliability of these tests. But this is less so the case for this specific documentary, and I want to talk about the ethical concerns that this documentary brings up and some of the good and bad things that I noticed while watching this. Let's get into it. Before we get started talking about the documentary, I want to talk about my kind of credentials and some of the biases that might come with that, and some of the biases that actually might not come with that you might think normally would. So I am a psychology graduate student. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I'm aiming to be a clinical psychologist somewhere in the next 6 to 7 years if all goes according to plan. I am also a certified MBTI practitioner, and I have worked with more than 100 individuals in typing sessions and assessments using Myers-Briggs theory. What this does mean is that I do have a preference for MBTI and personality testing, and I tend to view these things in a positive light. What this doesn't mean, though, is that I am affiliated with MBTI or any of these other companies. As an MBTI practitioner, I am an individual person. I do not work for MBTI. I am not affiliated with MBTI. I only am a certified practitioner of their model. It's kind of like becoming a doctor or any other type of licensed professional. You get your licensure and you are not attached to the company or place that you got your licensure. I am an independent agent with my own thoughts who is not affiliated with MBTI or these corporations in any sort of way. Persona actually starts out with a segment that I thought was pretty good. It starts off by interviewing and showing people who are prominent members of the personality typology community. The primary focus that they choose is Frank James, and other people like Lijo and Megan Lavoda make brief appearances in this documentary as well. But what this showed to me was that the people who were making Persona were actually interested in reaching out to people who are in the personality typology community and seeing how it impacted them on a day-to-day basis, or why they choose to use and view these particular assessments and models in the way they do. I think that MBTI and personality theories can have a large positive impact on people's lives, and this is especially something you're going to see when you actually interact with people in these type communities, instead of just looking at maybe the corporations who use these assessments for unethical reasons. The unethical use of personality assessments is really the primary point of this particular documentary. The real start of Persona is when we see the backstory of a young man who believes that he was discriminated against when it comes to a job selection because of a score that he received on a personality assessment. A friend of the employer told him that he was not chosen for a specific job because of a score that he received on a pre-screening personality assessment. So essentially they asked him to take a personality assessment beforehand as part of the kind of application process, and because of a specific score on this, he was not chosen for the job. Now, this young man's father is a lawyer, so they chose to kind of look deeper into this and see how far this rabbit hole really goes. The interesting thing about this is that they later interview the head of marketing, I think, for the MBTI corporation, or someone involved in marketing for MBTI, and they talk to him about the ethical concerns of using MBTI for selection. They specifically state that it is against their code of ethics to use the MBTI assessment for any form of selection. And as a certified practitioner, I can tell you that this is the truth. When you take the certification course, one of the things they tell you is that if anyone ever asks you to use it for some form of selection, you are to immediately turn them down as a potential client or customer. So on a kind of regular day-to-day basis, the MBTI Corporation does not support the use of their assessment for any form of selection. Now, what he does say, and what the people in the documentary talk about, is that it's not really the MBTI that's the issue when it comes to selection. It's that a lot of third-party personality development corporations are creating systems that are very similar to MBTI or other models like Big Five, and then selling them to corporations to use for selection. So essentially, they're creating 80 to 90% the same thing as MBTI or Big Five, selling them under a different name with different types of models or traits associated with them, and then allowing corporations to use these for selection. Let's take a moment to talk about some of the legal and ethical concerns of using personality assessments or similar types of things for selection when it comes to jobs or workplaces, these sorts of things. So, under American discrimination law, you cannot use any form of cognitive test to screen somebody for a job. So, for example, it is illegal to use or give somebody an IQ test to determine if they are going to be good enough for your specific job. This makes sense because you don't want someone to be able to discriminate based on something that you have no general control over. But there becomes a really hazy line when we look at the specifics of what is allowed versus what is not allowed. So a job aptitude test is something that is entirely allowed in the job selection process. Say, for example, you wanted to become an engineer for a specific corporation. They are 100% allowed to give you some sort of engineering aptitude test. How much do you as an individual know about engineering? Are you able to complete these specific engineering tasks? Now, this makes sense because if you're applying for a really high-end job, they want someone who's going to be able to do that job. Now, the difficult thing to differentiate here is that someone with a higher IQ, for example, is far more likely to perform better on an engineering task or an engineering test than someone who does not have a high IQ, for example. Now, this isn't always going to be the case, but you can see where the line starts to blur here because a lot of the time, aptitude tests can be created in such a way that they reflect things like IQ and can be used for natural discrimination. The military absolutely uses an aptitude test for new individuals and for selection purposes when it comes to hiring for higher-end jobs. Now, this is something that is not strictly an IQ test, but it's like 95% of the way to being an IQ test. Is this unethical? It's hard to say because, you want people who can do specific tasks or do certain things when it comes to jobs. This is where one of the core concepts of industrial psychology comes into play, and this is known as congruency. And congruency is how well you as an individual fit with the job that you are working in or applying for in terms of personality and your individual skills. Essentially, are you congruent with this job? Are you going to be able to work there without a lot of conflict? So let me give you an example of this, and then we can talk about the potential ethical concerns of using personality assessments to maybe discriminate based on this. Say you wanted to apply for a job in sales, specifically like a car salesman. Now, when you think of a car salesman, you typically think of someone who's relatively extroverted, someone who is able to interact with people without much issue. They are usually relatively charming. They are somewhat spontaneous, but they're also firm because they want to be able to make sales. There's a specific type of person and personality that people are specifically looking for when they're looking to hire a car salesman. Now, imagine you are someone who's extremely introverted. You do not like talking to people. You do not like to interact with others in general, and then you get frustrated when you have to talk with other people. Imagine you applied to be a car salesman just because you really needed the money. Now, this might be a waste of time for both you and them because you are not going to perform well in that specific job field because you are not congruent as an individual with the field that you have chosen. Does this mean that somebody shouldn't be hired for these specific reasons? It's hard to tell because if we used a personality assessment beforehand, imagine if you gave somebody just even something like Big Five and you were asking them to be a car salesman, and they scored in the 5th percentile on extroversion. So they're very, very, very introverted, like one of the world's most introverted people. Is this the type of person that you would typically want to work in a sales position that's going to require a lot of social interaction? No. At one point in Persona, they actually interview a man who currently works in the field of developing personality assessments and similar tools for purposes like selection and congruency. And his general opinion was that he thinks people would be generally happier if they were using these assessments to allow them to be kind of matched with some sort of best fit job when it comes to their personality. And this is generally the idea that organizational and industrial psychology proposes. When I took my course on job development, when I took that course and we learned how to essentially help people find their best fit job, this is things we talked about. These are concepts that were brought up frequently. We learned about the idea of congruency and why it's important to help someone find a job field that is a good fit for them. Now, the real ethical concern, and this is the real thing that the Persona documentary is attempting to talk about here, is the ethical concern of not giving people a chance because of their initial score on an assessment. And I think that's a totally fair critique and concern that people should have when it comes to personality assessments. A lot of the times, personality assessments are administered after somebody has already gotten a job or has been accepted into the kind of company, and then they help them maybe choose a project or branch within the company that would be best fit for them as an individual. When you look at work in general, when you look at corporations, you want to have a wide variety of people. Almost every corporation in the world or every job field is going to need every type of person for some particular thing. Even if you're working in sales, for example, and you need a very socially extroverted person to work a sales position, on the back end, you're going to need probably someone who's very introverted and detail focused to work on the booking and the numbers associated with those sales. This brings in the concept known as predictive validity. And predictive validity is a scientific term that means how well is a certain score on a specific assessment going to predict some sort of outcome. It doesn't need to be any particular outcome. So for example, IQ is highly correlated with more wealth in life. So if you have a higher IQ, you're far more likely to make more money in life. Now, the issue with predictive validity is that there's many different types of predictive validity, and they don't all measure the exact same type of thing. The issue that jobs think about when they are attempting to hire someone with a personality assessment is they're attempting to gauge the predictive validity of how well someone is going to perform in a specific job field because of their personality assessment. This is not something that is typically allowed when we talk about personality assessments. There usually is some sort of correlation here, like the idea of introversion and extroversion and being a salesman or somebody who's not going to have to interact with people. You might find that there's certain correlations with how well somebody works or performs in a specific job or job field. But what personality assessments are really used for in industrial and organizational psychology, is to determine the predictive validity of someone's likelihood of choosing a certain job. Not how well they're going to perform in that job, but whether or not they're more likely to end up in that job across their lifespan. So for example, if somebody takes an MBTI assessment and they score as an INFP or an INFJ personality type, their likelihood of becoming a therapist or a psychologist is extremely higher than other people of other personality types. Does this mean they're going to be a better psychologist or therapist than the other types who attempt to work in the specific field? No, the predictive validity of these specific assessments is not measuring how well they perform in these specific job fields. It's only measuring how likely they are to want to work in these specific types of fields and the satisfaction they receive from working in them. At one point in the Persona documentary, they talk to a man who works in New York City, and he works as kind of a business coach for a class of people to help people who are jobless get jobs. And one of the things that they're teaching these individuals is how to beat personality assessments that are used for selection purposes. Essentially, what are the traits that people in specific jobs are looking for on these personality assessments when they are hiring? Now, this is a sad process because, yes, this is something that is relatively unethical, these corporations using these assessments for those specific purposes. How they were intended to be used and how I feel like they're used a majority of the time in organizational psychology is something that you use far before the application process. So say, for example, if you were a jobless person and you went to one of these places that was going to help you look for a job, they might have you take the MBTI, they might have you take the Big Five or some other form of personality assessment. And what they're going to do from there is say, look at the predictive validity of the scores that you got compared to the jobs that are going to be likely good choices for you. Imagine yourself doing this job. Would you feel satisfied doing this job? If the individual says, yes, I would feel satisfied doing that, that means we know we've done well. We've essentially found the congruency for them as an individual. They are this type of person, they have these specific personality traits, and this goes well with these particular types of jobs. So what we would do from there is instead have them apply for jobs that are looking for those specific personality types or traits. Essentially, we're saying, look, if you think you would be good in this field and these scores match with you as an individual, if you go and apply for these types of places, then you're already going to have a much easier time fitting into these work environments because your personality is already congruent with the type of person that they're looking for. Near the end of the documentary, they bring up the newer science that is being used alongside personality assessments, where they point a camera in front of someone who is taking the personality assessment and have an AI read their facial expressions as they read and react to certain questions and they think about certain things. They call this a facial action unit. And using this AI, they can determine whether or not somebody is lying or how they feel and get a different type of score alongside their primary personality assessment score about who they are as an individual and how likely they are to interact and react in certain ways. This is actually not a new concept. Personality typology has been studying this type of thing for a few decades now, and in personality typology, it's known as voltology. And voltology is the attempt to associate facial expressions and behavior, such as me moving my hands like this, with certain types of cognition. What AI is attempting to do here is find out what the true underlying motivations of someone's cognitions are, different from the answers that they're giving on a certain personality assessment. And this is almost kind of backwards, because when you look at how corporations use these assessments unethically, a lot of the times they want you to respond in a certain specific way, even if you aren't that type of person. There's a portion of the documentary where the guy who's coaching the individuals on how to get a job talks about one of the specific questions on one of the assessments, and it's, have you lied any time in the past month? And he goes, look at all you angels. All of you said, no, I haven't lied in the past month. 99% of people have at least told one small lie in, the past month in their life. And this is something that personality assessments that are used for selection fail to account for. And they assume everybody is this perfect being. But when you use these facial expression readers and these AIs alongside these type of things, I feel like these corporations are going to quickly see that, yeah, most people aren't perfect and most people don't have perfect lifestyles and most people tell lies occasionally and they have issues in their own life. And the issue with this type of selection is you're trying to find the absolute perfect individual for every single job position, when in reality, humans don't work like that. And a lot of the times you have to foster that type of growth when it comes to hiring and selecting people for businesses. You can hire someone who may not have a lot of skill or aptitude in a specific field, but you give them 6 months, you give them a year, and they may very well be your best employee. So let me kind of summarize my thoughts on the Persona documentary and give you my kind of final verdict here. So I know I didn't talk about the documentary in and of itself very much, but that's because I was more so concerned about the concepts that they were attempting to discuss and the things that they were attempting to show throughout the documentary. And the primary concept they're attempting to discuss is the ethical concern of using personality assessments for selection purposes that border on discrimination. Now, I personally believe that this is an extremely valid concern and that the message that they're putting forth about these things and these concerns are very valid, and you should be concerned about corporations maybe using these assessments to prevent you from getting certain types of jobs or getting certain positions. Now, what you shouldn't be as concerned with is people using personality assessments for congruency purposes. As I mentioned earlier, before the application process and after the application process are places that you might find that personality assessments can be exceptionally helpful. So again, if you take a personality assessment, you might be able to find a job that is a very good fit for you as an individual. But corporations shouldn't be using personality assessments to discriminate or prevent people from getting jobs. Essentially, personality assessments should be something that are positive and help people find the right direction for them as an individual in life. For final critiques about this documentary, there were a few things that I thought stood out that I wasn't a huge fan of. One of them, again, was kind of the lack of depth on certain topics, where you could tell that they were really just scratching the surface of the implications of the things that they were talking about. Another implication is that I could tell that this documentary was fairly biased towards a left political view. And even as someone who considers myself relatively left myself, I thought that there were times where they were talking about things like prejudice and how the assessments were made for old white guys and these type of things, where I was like, all right, I mean, I get what you're trying to say, but it doesn't really seem like it relates too heavily with maybe the things that you're attempting to discuss in this particular documentary. But other than that, I think that this was a decent documentary. And if you're someone who's interested in typology and maybe interested in learning more about the ethical concerns of using personality assessments in incorrect ways, then you might want to check out Persona, The Dark Truth Behind Personality Types. I don't think it was mind-blowing or exceptional in any way. It was a pretty average documentary overall, but it was really nice to see some attention around the personality typology community, even if it was in a negative light. That said, I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts on this down in the comment section below. If you've seen Persona and you want to let me know what you think, let me know down in the comment section below. Other than that, I would like to remind people that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurasec.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. This has been Asura from Asura Psych. Have a good one.